9 innocent women, 1 silent execution. And in just days, the mightiest empire in the galaxy began to crumble not from warships, but from whispers in the dark. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a storm of vengeance built by people who refused to be forgotten. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to the channel and show a thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's jump into the story. The galaxy was quiet that morning. Ships moved between stars, traders haggled over cargo, and empires hummed with the rhythm of daily control. But in a far-off corner of the known systems, on a mining colony called Vedra 7, something happened. That would shake the stars themselves. It wasn't loud. There were no explosions, no fire in the sky. Just a quiet, simple message broadcast through official channels. 9 human women, executed for crimes never listed, names never given, at dawn in the central plaza. The Empire called it a legal measure. A statement. A warning to anyone who thought rebellion was an option. But even the guards who carried it out felt something was off. The square was silent as the women were led to the gallows, their faces calm, as if they had already said their goodbyes to a world that had turned its back. There was no trial, no proof, just a cold decision by someone high above in the imperial chain of command. What the Empire didn't know was that these women weren't just anyone. They were threads in a vast invisible web that stretched across human space. One of them, Mara Yoon, had once been a starship technician, now retired and raising her daughter on Vedra 7. Another, Callan Vire, was known in the underworld as the former lover of a man who once built stealth drives for resistance groups. A third, Lani Dor, worked as a singer in an outpost bar where soldiers gathered, drank, and told their stories to anyone who would listen. One of the executed women was the younger sister of Lise Ren, a former intelligence broker who had lived quietly for the last 5 years, far from politics, in a cold station orbiting a gas giant. When he saw the transmission, something in him broke. He didn't speak, he didn't cry. He simply got up, walked to a storage locker, and unlocked the terminal he had sworn never to touch again. Inside were access codes, contact points, and names he hadn't thought about in years. Another was married to Ian Kaur, a man whose name never made the news but whose work powered dozens of unregistered ships. He had built cloaking systems, energy dampeners, and false ID generators for people trying to disappear. When he learned of his wife's death, he shut down his shop, burned his ledgers, and disappeared into deep space. Days later, an old Imperial supply station reported a strange hacking attempt, so advanced it left no trace of who had done it, or why. The news of the execution spread slowly at first. The Empire hadn't intended it to reach far. But someone leaked the footage. Someone made sure the faces of the women were seen, not as traitors, but as mothers, sisters, wives, and friends. The video traveled from soldier to soldier, across forgotten colonies and crowded spaceports. The silence with which they died haunted those who watched. It wasn't defiance or fear in their faces, it was resolve. That was more dangerous than any weapon. Within 48 hours, the whispers began. Quiet calls, anonymous messages, encrypted communiques sent across old rebel channels. But it wasn't just rebels who answered. It was smugglers, old soldiers, retired officers, engineers, who knew where the weaknesses in the Empire's armor lay. And it wasn't about revenge, it was about balance. About a response. About the understanding that something had changed. At the edge of human space, an old freighter called the Iron Veil vanished without a trace while passing through an Imperial checkpoint. The ship had no weapons, no cargo worth stealing. It was presumed lost to a technical fault. But those who were watching closely knew better. The crew had been handpicked, veterans, ghosts from old wars, people who hadn't been seen in years. The Iron Veil was not lost. It had simply gone dark, back on Earth, deep underground in what was once a military shelter, a quiet council gathered. They weren't politicians. They weren't even united by one flag. There was no anthem, no speeches, just a round table, and a shared truth. Among them sat General Myra Tass, once disgraced, now returned. There was also Aiden Marr, a tactician who had been kicked out of the Navy for speaking out. And in the corner, half asleep, was Finna Lark, a rogue economist with a mind built for sabotage. The only thing they had in common was the knowledge that the Empire had made its first real mistake. Not because of what they did, but because of who they did it to. They had drawn blood from a people who had learned to survive through fire and silence. Humanity wasn't united, not by law or leadership, but they were bound by something older. The need to protect their own. The Empire didn't know it yet. They thought they had delivered a message. But what they had actually done was light a match. And across the cold reaches of space, unseen by the sensors and ignored by the bureaucrats, a spark began to grow. This time, the war wouldn't start with an invasion. It would start in the shadows, where names whispered in secret became orders, where grief turned into action, where silence wasn't surrender, it was planning. And the Empire, for the first time in centuries, would learn what it meant to fear. The dark dot it began not with armies or starships, but with silence. The kind of silence that crawled into a room before anything else happened. One by one, reports started arriving at scattered Imperial outposts, small problems, easily dismissed. A supply freighter hadn't checked in. A mining drone lost contact. For 12 hours, a listening post stopped responding. These things weren't unusual in the far reaches of space. Technical issues, pirates, solar storms, there was always a reason. But there was something different this time. Something subtle and uncomfortable that no one could quite put into words. The Iron Veil, a long-haul cargo ship with no weapons and no known enemies, was one of the first to vanish. It had passed through an Imperial checkpoint near the Denari Expanse, sent a final log, and then was never seen again. The Empire wrote it off as an accident. But those who remembered the execution on Vedra 7 began to wonder. The Iron Veil wasn't just a ship, it was a signal. A few days later, a communications relay station on the edge of Imperial territory went offline. Engineers blamed a power surge. But when it came back online, part of the station's memory logs had been wiped clean. No one knew who had done it or why. By the end of the week, a patrol ship, the Meridian Whisper, was found adrift. The crew was alive but locked inside their own escape pods. There were no injuries, no signs of violence. Just confusion and humiliation. It was a message, and the message was clear. Someone was watching, and they were very good at what they did. Captain Meritin, a seasoned officer who had faced human resistance during the early expansion wars, was one of the first to raise the alarm. She reviewed the patterns, studied the disappearances, and recognized the signs. This wasn't random. It was quiet, coordinated, and very deliberate. She warned her superiors, but they ignored her concerns. The Empire was too large, too powerful, too confident to believe that these minor incidents could mean anything more. Meanwhile, in the shadows of space, the plan was unfolding. The people who had once lived in silence were now moving. Ian Kor, the engineer whose wife had been among the executed, sent encrypted schematics to old allies. Lise Wren, the intelligence broker, reactivated dormant codes buried in forgotten satellites. Messages flew through hidden channels, not from one leader, but from dozens of them: warlords, hackers, ex-soldiers, smugglers. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't follow orders. But they all understood the mission. Aydn Marr, the tactician, hiding in a bunker deep under Earth's surface, didn't need meetings to know the storm was growing. He monitored Imperial chatter, listened to panicked updates from border outposts, and smiled each time a signal went dark. Finna Lark, the rogue economist who once rigged stock markets for fun, had joined the cause. She didn't believe in war the way others did. She believed in chaos, and she was very good at making it. The Empire still had the larger fleet, the stronger weapons and more soldiers. But they were prepared for a war they could see, a battle in space, two sides, clear lines. They weren't ready for enemies who disappeared before the alarm sounded, or who struck without leaving a trace. They weren't ready for war without uniforms dotting a small moonbase near the Sinner cluster. A black market arms dealer named Brenvus received a delivery he hadn't requested. Inside the crate was a simple message, "You know what to do." Beneath it were sealed boxes of advanced jamming devices, stolen Imperial access cards, and a portable AI that could rewrite security codes in seconds. Bren didn't ask questions. He just started making calls. All across the galaxy, people who had no reason to trust one another started working together. Not because they were told to, but because they had to. The Empire had made a mistake that could not be ignored. They had killed the wrong people. And now, those left behind were going to answer in the only way they knew how, by making themselves impossible to catch. Back in the Imperial capital, advisors argued about responses. Some wanted more patrols, stronger security. Others called it paranoia. These are isolated incidents, they said. Nothing serious, Captain Tin disagreed. She watched as more ships went missing, as more systems glitched, and she felt the fear begin to spread. Not fear of an enemy they could see, but fear of the unknown. The people fighting back weren't using warships. They were using stolen data, ancient codes, secret tunnels in cyberspace. They struck where the Empire felt safe behind their own walls, within their own systems. And they didn't always fight with violence. Sometimes, the greatest damage was done with nothing but silence and waiting. When the Empire finally realized that this was more than a few rebels, it was too late to stop it. The network had already spread too far. Too many hands were working. Behind the scenes, too many voices were speaking in shadows. The quiet war had begun, and the Empire, for all its strength, had no idea where the next blow would land. And so, the galaxy held its breath. Because the humans were moving now, not in grand armies, but in whispers, in shadows, in places no sensor could track. And every missing ship, every offline signal, every strange silence, was not a mistake. It was part of something much bigger. The real war had begun, and it wore no face. There was no sound when it started, no attack ships, no warning alarms. Just a strange delay in a shipment of food supplies to an outer colony, then another delay, then a third. At first, the Empire blamed system errors. Freight companies were told to double-check their logs. Local commanders were told to tighten their schedules. But soon, the delays turned into full disruptions. Trade routes collapsed overnight. Medical shipments disappeared. Entire planets were cut off from supplies they had depended on for years. The Empire had seen rebellions before. What it had never seen was an enemy who didn't aim at their soldiers, but at their spreadsheets in an underground command center hidden beneath an old chemical refinery on Earth. Aiden Marr stood before a glowing table full of data streams. He wasn't a soldier in the traditional sense. He didn't carry weapons or wear armor, but he was a commander all the same. Across from him, Finna Lark adjusted her glasses, grinning as lines of financial reports lit up in red. She was the architect behind what was happening now, the one who had turned numbers into bombs and bank accounts into battlefields. She didn't fire missiles. She triggered market collapses. They had studied the Empire for years. Its ships were strong, its armies well-trained, but its economy was a machine held together by careful balances. There were thousands of supply chains, fuel contracts, loan agreements, and stock values that all had to work perfectly. And Finna had learned how to break them. It started with false reports leaked into shipping databases. Then came small shifts in exchange rates. Then came the sabotage of central banking systems, that handled currency for half a dozen star systems. The result was confusion, then chaos, then fear. On Vedra 9, a planet once considered the Empire's safest economic hub, traders watched as prices for basic materials doubled in a single day. Cargo insurers pulled out, ship captains refused new jobs. Banking officials tried to stabilize the system, but their screens showed strange values, endless loops, missing data. The Empire's digital infrastructure, thought to be untouchable, was showing cracks. Those cracks spread quickly. And still, no one had fired a single shot out in orbit around Dronos 3. The Empire's Ministry of Trade met in emergency session. The room was filled with voices, angry, confused, panicked. One official claimed it was sabotage. Another insisted it was just a coincidence. But the truth couldn't be denied. The market was bleeding, and no one knew how to stop it. That was when they first heard the name, Lint. No one knew who he was, or even if he was real. But messages began appearing in the Empire's internal systems, short phrases written in bold text. "Hello, I'm Lint. I see your numbers. Check your vaults." Most dismissed it as a prank. But when they actually checked the vaults, some accounts had been drained dry. In truth, Lint wasn't one person. He was a mask, a name, used by several hackers working under Finna Lark's lead. They weren't just humans either. A few came from other species tired of being under the Empire's thumb. They shared one goal: to show the Empire that its greatest strength, its complex and massive economy, was also its greatest weakness. Every glitch was a warning. Every crash was a statement. While Finna led the digital war, Aiden coordinated with contacts on the ground. Former dock workers helped reroute shipments. Independent traders spread misinformation about price hikes and supply shortages. Old spies fed false leads to the Empire's investigators, sending them chasing ghosts. All across the galaxy, people were beginning to feel the pressure. Families couldn't afford fuel. Stations ran low on food. And still, the Empire insisted everything was under control. Back on Earth, the war room was quiet but focused. Finna leaned back in her chair, watching as the currency of the Imperial credit lost value for the 5th day in a row. She didn't cheer, she didn't smile. Instead, she opened a new screen and began preparing the next phase. They had the Empire's attention now. But attention wasn't enough. They needed surrender. In the Empire's central command tower on Vorton Prime, Supreme Minister Haldren paced back and forth. Reports came in faster than he could read them. The economy was sliding toward collapse. Trade pacts were being cancelled. Allied systems were turning away, afraid of being pulled into the storm. He had always believed in control, order, discipline, structure. But now he realized they were at the mercy of something they didn't even understand. What terrified them most wasn't the sabotage, it was how clean it all was. There was no smoke, no blood. Just numbers quietly changing, and systems failing as if they had decided to die on their own. It didn't look like war, but it was war. And they were losing. For Aiden and Finna, the mission wasn't about destruction. It was about forcing a decision. They didn't want to crush the Empire. They wanted to break its confidence. The Empire was still dangerous, still armed, still massive. But for the first time, it looked unsure. And in war, doubt was as deadly as any weapon. The Empire had made the mistake of thinking the threat was far away on some battlefield, in some future rebellion. But the truth was simple. The war had already started, and it was happening right under their feet. The Empire had never known fear. For centuries, it ruled the stars with confidence and power. Its fleets stretched across systems, its leaders sat in tall towers above the clouds, and its laws were absolute. But now, that power was cracking. Not from bombs or invasions, but from something quieter, an invisible storm that had taken hold of everything they depended on. Food didn't arrive, credit systems crashed. Entire sectors stopped listening. Their strength was slipping away, not because they were beaten in battle, but because they didn't know how to fight what they couldn't see. In the command hall of the imperial capital, Supreme Commander Craveng stood before a screen filled with chaos. Red alerts, missing ships, collapsing supply lines. His jaw was tight, his voice quiet. He had seen battles before, brutal, loud, chaotic, but this was different. This wasn't war in the old way. It was something colder, something smarter. His advisors begged him to strike back with force. Launch fleets, take human colonies, show strength. But he knew that wouldn't work. They weren't losing ships. They were losing trust. And trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. Far away, hidden in a drifting station near the edge of known space, General Myra Tass watched the same reports. She wasn't smiling. The humans had won the upper hand, but it hadn't been easy. Many of them had worked in silence for years. They hadn't asked for power or revenge. All they had wanted was to be left alone. But the executions had changed. Everything. Now they had leverage. Now the Empire had to listen. A message arrived at the Imperial Palace, direct, secure, and clear. It came not from a government, but from Myra herself. A simple video file, no threats, no demands shouted in rage. Just her voice, calm and steady. "You don't need to fall," she said. "But if you keep pretending this isn't happening, you will." She gave 3 conditions: public acknowledgement of the executions as crimes, an economic reparations to affected colonies, and a guarantee that no human worlds would be interfered with again. There were no requests for territory, number, talk of replacing the Empire, just a line drawn in the dust. Cross it, and the chaos would continue. Respect it, and there could be peace. The Emperor, Jern Valen, received the message in silence. He was old by any measure, but his mind was still sharp. He had watched empires rise and fall. He had ruled longer than most species lived. But this was new. He hadn't been defeated in battle. He had been outplayed. Everything he had built was still standing, but it was hollow, and he knew it. He sat alone in the throne room, eyes on the stars beyond the glass, and tried to understand what had gone wrong. For Jern, pride was a heavy thing. Surrender was unthinkable. But destruction was worse. Already, riots had broken out on 3 imperial planets. Loyalist officers had started questioning orders. Traitors had begun refusing imperial currency. The systems that once obeyed him without question were hesitating. One more push, and the Empire might collapse, not because it was beaten by an enemy, but because it could no longer stand on its own legs. In the war room beneath Earth's surface, Myra Tass waited. Her officers stood nearby, not celebrating, just watching. Aiden Marr looked tired but focused. Finna Lark paced quietly, checking live feeds from Imperial markets. They all knew the message had been received. Now came the moment of truth. Would the Empire change course, or would it gamble everything on a final hopeless stand? Hours passed. Then, a new message appeared. This time, it was a direct transmission from the Imperial Palace. The image of Emperor Jern Valen flickered to life, his face drawn, his voice steady but lacking its old pride. "We accept," he said. "We recognize what was done, and we will not allow it to happen again." The war, as strange and quiet as it had been, was over. The terms were agreed upon. No fanfare. No parades. Just a sentence, and then the screen went dark. Back in the command room, Myra let out a slow breath. No one cheered. No one shouted in victory. This had never been about triumph. It had been about survival, and a demand to be seen. For generations, humanity had been told it was lesser, primitive, disorganized. But now, it had shown something far more powerful than force. It had shown that even the largest empire in the galaxy could be stopped not with armies, but with will, with unity, with the refusal to be silent, the empire didn't fall. Not completely. It still ruled many systems. It still had fleets and laws, but its image had changed. It no longer seemed invincible, and that was the real victory. Across the galaxy, others had watched. Other species who had remained quiet, who had bowed their heads and accepted their place. Now they began to speak. Not in open rebellion, but in small, brave steps. The humans had lit a fire, not of war, but of possibility. In the years that followed, Vedra 7 became a symbol. A small, quiet world where 9 women were taken for nothing. No statues were built, no holidays declared. But in taverns and classrooms, aboard cargo ships and deep space outposts, their story was told. A reminder that sometimes, the greatest strength comes from the quietest voices, and that when enough of those voices come together, they can shake even the strongest empire.